Prime Minister, thank you so much for coming in. Thank you for your time.
Pleasure to be here. Pleasure to be back in Saskatoon.
Prime Minister, as you know, this province is dealing with a pretty significant economic downturn. What specific help do you offer in last week's budget?
Well, I think a big part of it is recognizing that the mandate we got elected on was helping the middle class and those working hard to join it. That's where the childcare investments we made, $7 billion over the next 10 years, is going to help a lot of families with young kids. What we did last year, lowering taxes on the middle class, raising them on the wealthiest 1%, and delivering a Canada Child benefit will make a big difference in the lives of Canadians with kids. On the flip side of it, the investments in infrastructure we're making, whether it's in roads and bridges and public transit or social housing and green infrastructure, it's going to put a lot of people to work right now and make sure that we have opportunities for growth in the future, as well as recognizing that the workplace is changing. The kinds of jobs people are doing are more automated, requiring more skills. So there's a huge focus on this budget on upskilling, on getting opportunities for people to go back to school in ways that fits or get new training in ways that fits their lives, whether they're part-time, whether they're dealing with young kids, whether they're focused on stuck on being on EI, these kinds of things that allow investments in people that are going to keep them working into the future is really important for us.
Now, First Nations leaders looked at the budget, and many say they still feel shortchanged on health, on education, on social spending, on housing. How much of a priority do you really place on the TRC recommendations, and especially when it comes to opening the wallet?
Oh, I put a huge priority on that. That's why we put forward historic amounts of $8.4 billion in last year's budget. In this year's budget, there's a further $3.4 billion over 5 years on infrastructure. There's $828 million in specifically for Indigenous health, child benefits, child care, prenatal and postnatal care, the kinds of things that Indigenous communities and leaders have been asking for a long time. Is it fixing everything right now? No. There is, as we know, an awful lot of work to do to catch up to where the rest of the country is. Unfortunately, there's a big gap for Indigenous peoples. But because we want to work with them to determine the capacities and to make the improvements, we can't just throw money at the problem and impose a solution. We have to work with them to get it in. And we're unfolding significant initiatives and serious amounts of money.
But how do you make that more of more direct impact to people? Because we hear these big numbers and we hear the platitudes, but for many people on First Nations, life hasn't changed. They don't see anything changing.
Well, let's talk about specific metrics then of the places with long-term drinking water advisories. We've taken 18 communities off those long-term advisories, and not by just dropping iodine pills in the water. We're actually investing in water treatment plants that they're going to be able to maintain, so they're long-term off. Over 2,000 Indigenous kids started the school year in brand new schools, and there's dozens of new schools in the process of being constructed because of the money that we've started flowing from last year to this year. We're investing significantly more money in a broad range of things that is going to make a real tangible difference. Is it going to fix everything this year? No, it's not. Is it making a significant difference as we move forward? Absolutely.
Now, you've been to Northern Saskatchewan and you've talked to young Indigenous Canadians who don't feel valued. They don't feel they have a future. So how does all this translate for them? For those kids on First Nations across the country?
In a number of ways. I mean, I had the tremendous pleasure of sitting down with some of the students from La Loche of a number of weeks ago to talk about the kinds of initiatives we're putting forward, the kinds of work that they're getting going on in their communities. A number of things. Yes, there's more money in terms of schooling, of education, opportunities for teachers to have better places to stay and therefore come to the more remote places. Also opportunities to provide mentorship to those young people. The other side of thing, we've made significant investments is into culture and languages, because we know that Indigenous communities in which there is a strong emphasis on culture and language, the suicide rate is lower, and the opportunities that young people feel and the pride in their own identity is stronger, and their outcomes are better. So these are all things that we are working on, but as you say, it's a long-term project.
Your approach to deficit financing is obviously completely different from Premier Brad Wall's approach to deficit financing. How do you justify taking the country this deeply into debt?
Well, I think first of all, I disagree that it's deeply into debt. Our debt to GDP ratio is the best of any of the G7 countries, and we are on a very responsible fiscal track. But what we also know is at a time when interest rates are low, it makes sense to be investing in public transit. It makes sense to be investing in our universities and our training colleges. It makes sense to be putting money in the pockets of the middle class, as we do with the Canada Child Benefit, so that they can feel more confident as consumers, as people saving for retirement, strengthening the CPP to give people confidence that there's going to be money for them to retire. These are all things that we know is not just spending money, it's investing money that is going to give returns in greater economic growth down the line, more empowered and capable Canadians in terms of getting good jobs. It's the focus of saying, let's invest in the things we're going to need tomorrow, right now, so we can get this country rolling.
Yeah. But the last two Liberal governments before yours had to take some pretty drastic actions to deal with debt and deficit. So can you guarantee us, insofar as anybody could, that that's not going to be your successor's main challenge?
Well, first of all, the debt to GDP ratio was up around 70% back in the 90s. We had to get it under control. We got it under control. We're now down to a very fiscally responsible position. And what we're beginning to see now is the low growth that we had for 10 years under the Conservative government is starting to turn around. Unemployment is down. Jobs are being created. There is economic growth on a positive trajectory. We still have more work to do, but the benefits of our choice of investing in our communities and in our future is starting to lead to better opportunities for Canadians.
As you're well aware, the Premier of Saskatchewan has been one of the loudest critics of a proposed carbon price or carbon tax. Given what has happened in the United States in the last 24 hours and President Trump's executive order, are you still committed to a price on carbon?
I am very committed that Canadian economic and environmental policy will be determined in Ottawa, not in Washington, D.C. We know that there is a significant responsibility to deal with climate change for future generations, but there's also an opportunity in investing in the kind of green jobs and green opportunities that we know are there. The investments Saskatchewan's making in carbon sequestration is a great opportunity and a great example of the kinds of things we need to do. So putting a price on pollution that we don't want makes sense. Now, how we go about that, how that's done, whether it's through pricing mechanisms or whether it's through a tax, will actually be up to the province. The province of Saskatchewan, like all provinces, can determine the mechanism they want to bring in, and all the revenues from that pricing of carbon pollution will remain in the province where they're generated. So this is an opportunity for the Premier to make decisions about who needs help through this transition towards a lower carbon economy, and that's up to him to do. This is no money coming into the federal government. This is simply incentivizing behaviors that are more efficient and less polluting.
Given, though, that capital is fluid and we share this continent with the United States, with respect, sir, is it just a little bit naive to say that we can make these policies in Ottawa without paying attention to what happens in the rest of the continent?
Well, what's happening in the rest of the continent is states and indeed cities across the United States are moving forward aggressively on carbon reduction targets. Investors, whether it's high-tech investors or energy investors, are looking for better incentives and efficiencies. We know that climate change means that we're going to have to walk down a lower carbon path in the coming decades. The question is, do we want to be dragged into that future kicking and screaming, or do we want to lead it like the innovators we can be? You don't want to get too far out in front, I agree, but there's a tremendous opportunity for Canadian innovation, know-how, and leadership, like we see right here in Saskatchewan, to be driving successes that we need to see, not just across North America, but around the world.
Now, in a few days, we have heard we can expect your marijuana legislation to be introduced. And already we're hearing some provinces complain that in some ways Ottawa is abandoning half of this job, leaving so much of the detail up to the provinces. What do you say to that?
Well, first of all, everyone will have to wait to see what's actually in the legislation, and rather than speculating about it. But let's get back to the basics. The reason we're choosing to legalize, regulate, and control marijuana is for two things. It's to keep it out of the hands of our kids, who right now find it easier to buy a joint than a bottle of beer, and to remove the criminal elements from the marijuana trade, which is worth billions of dollars. To do that, we can treat it a little more like alcohol, for example, regulate it, control it, make sure that what is produced is of clear quality and provenance, and make sure that the consumer knows what they're getting while ensuring proper age restrictions on people who are trying to buy it. And like for alcohol or cigarettes, we're looking at and talking with the provinces. We've had many conversations with the provinces around whether the federal government should control sale or whether the provinces should control sale. And these are the kinds of things that we will put forward in the coming months.
Finally, Prime Minister, we are heading towards Canada's 150th birthday. We're still wrestling with issues like refugees, race relations, religion, even our relationship certainly with our Indigenous people. What concerns do you have about who we are as a nation?
Oh, I don't have very many concerns about that. I spend so much time talking with Canadians who quite rightly have questions about, well, how do we best do this? How do we make sure we're building for the future in an open and compassionate way while at the same time not being taken advantage of? How do we ensure our security in our communities and at our border and integrity of our immigration system while at the same time remaining a country that understands that people coming here to build lives and futures for themselves has been our success and will continue to be our success. And this is a conversation that Canadians have in a thoughtful, robust way that is exciting to be part of. But the one thing that I really am so encouraged by is Canadians understand that we define ourselves through a shared collection of values rather than an ethnicity or an identity or a religion or even a language. We've always been a place of many different origins, many different backgrounds, but we are united around shared values of openness, compassion, a willingness to work hard, a desire to be there for each other, for equality, for justice, for opportunity. And that story actually is one of the things that the rest of the world is looking to try and figure out, well, how is it that they can be as successful as they are in creating growth and opportunities through this diversity that's a source of strength.
Again, Prime Minister, thank you so much for your time.
It's always a pleasure, Garth.